Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Barbara Harris Whitfield is a researcher and author who has studied near-death experiences and spiritual awakenings for several decades. Her own NDE sent her on a path she never could have imagined, and her story will absolutely mesmerize you. Welcome. If you would, tell us a little bit about your story.
My story. I was born and raised in a working class area of Detroit, Michigan, 78 years ago. I grew up with a family that had just escaped Russia. So there was a lot of fear. There was a lot of fear and anxiety and probably a lot of PTSD, but we didn't know what that was at the time. And I met my husband and father of my 3 children when I was 14. We got married when I was 18 and he was 21. And I had the typical 1950s marriage where the husband went to work, he came home and read the newspaper, and the mother raised the children, stayed home, and usually cleaned every day. And as things evolved, we had the perfect home and the perfect kids and the perfect airplane and the perfect swimming pool. And of course, tremendous debt that put pressure on us all the time. And this is what I thought life was. And then in 1973, at the age of 30, I was pushed into a swimming pool as a joke. And my husband had pushed my daughter in with all her clothes on, and everybody laughed. So I got pushed in with all my clothes on, and my foot hooked on the side of the pool, and my back snapped. And I was underwater, and I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't get out because my leg had hooked on the side of the pool. Anyway, I finally got pulled out. We went home, and for the next 2 weeks, I tried to just stay off my feet for my backache. And at 2 weeks, I finally went into the hospital emergency room, and a friend of ours who was an orthopedist met me there, and they couldn't see anything on x-ray. So he just gave me pain pills, narcotics, and Valium as a muscle relaxant. And that's how I lived for the next 2 years, on Valium as a muscle relaxant and all kinds of opiates. And 4 hospitalizations with traction, and the drugs kept being increased and increased and increased until finally in 1975, 2 years later, the surgeon and I decided that I wasn't getting better and that we had to do something more drastic. So I had a, quote, spinal fusion, which was supposed to last 2 hours and lasted 5.5 because they found a couple of breaks that they couldn't see on x-ray. And I woke up in a very dramatic way to wake up. I woke up in a striker frame circle bed. That looks like a Ferris wheel for one. It's 2 big chrome hoops, and your body is suspended on a stretcher in the middle of the 2 chrome hoops. And 3 times a day, they would come in and put pillows over me and another stretcher, like a human sandwich, and they would turn on this electric bed, and it would rotate up and put me on my face. And I would lie like that for at least 20 minutes until they came back and rotated me back. Now, at this point, I weighed 82 pounds, and I think that was from taking all the drugs for so long. I weigh 110 now, and that's a good weight for me. So you can just imagine how thin I was. And a couple days after surgery, I started to die. Now, this was before they had ICU. This was, I was on a list of critically ill people. And I started to die. And I remember people coming in and pushing carts and machinery and hanging bags. One of them was blood. I already had an IV liquid, but clear liquid, but all kinds of things were being hooked up and put into me. And I remember at that point screaming, no, 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 leave me alone, let me die. Because for 2 years, I couldn't be a mother to my children. I couldn't be a wife to my husband. I was just feeling like at that point there was nothing left. So I really wanted to die. And then I lost consciousness. Oh, by the way, I was an atheist. I didn't believe in anything. I think that was from bitterness in my childhood because my mother had used hitting me and my brother and ridiculing us as a way to raise us. So I really had no belief in any higher consciousness or anything. And I just, as I passed out, I remember thinking, please let me die. And I woke up out in the hallway. It was in the middle of the night. I looked up and down the hall. I didn't see anybody. The lights were dim. And I thought, if they catch me out here, I'm going to get into trouble because I'm supposed to be suspended in that bed. And as I started to move back into my room, I realized I was nose level with the PA speaker that was mounted on the ceiling. And then I knew something was wrong. Something was weird. And I moved back into the room and saw my body lying in the circle bed. And I could hear myself chuckling because it certainly wasn't me anymore, she looked funny with tape wrapped around her nose and a tube to hold a tube in. So I thought about that for a few minutes, but it didn't bother me at all because I didn't have any pain and I felt peaceful. And I don't think I had felt that clear in a couple of years. And as I was standing there thinking that, I started moving through something that later on as a researcher, I could call a tunnel. At the time, I had no words for this, but I was out in the darkness and I could see energy churning in the darkness. And the energy was pulling out the light from the darkness, and it was all moving ahead of me towards the light. And then I felt hands come around my back and pull me into this lush warmth. And I realized it was my grandmother, my Bobby. Now, she had been dead for 14 years, and I had never once considered her to still be somewhere. Yet she was holding me. And together, we re-experienced all 19 years we were on the planet together. It was incredible because I wasn't just having my memories from my brain or my consciousness. I was seeing and feeling what she was feeling too. So I was my grandmother as well as I was myself. And together, the warmth, the love, it was just wonderful. And then the next thing I knew, she was moving away from me, but she let me know heart to heart that she would always be there waiting for me. And then I was back, but I wasn't back in my body. I realized I was back behind the nurse's station, and I could hear them talking about my case. And then I was back in my body. This was the first one. I had another one a week later. It seems like this first one prepared me for the second one because I don't know if I could have handled the one I'm going to tell you about next without first having this with my grandmother. So I was back in my body, back in the circle bed, and I started telling the nurses that were coming in that I had left the body. I had left my body. No, I didn't say I left my body. I said I left my bed. And they told me that was impossible. And every time I would try to protest back, they would give me a shot to knock me out. So I learned very quickly not to talk about it anymore. Now, a week later, when it happened again, I'm going to explain the triggers that we listed in our research. And one of the triggers is called the trauma transcendence interface. And this is very important because a lot of people, as they get traumatized by something huge, instead of staying with it, they leave. This is another trigger for us to leave and go into another reality. So the second one that I had a week later I was not close to death anymore. I was not on the critical list, What happened was they forgot about me after they had rotated me onto my face. And at 82 pounds, that canvas that I was lying on my belly was so uncomfortable that I started calling, but the door was closed. And then I started screaming. And I became hysterical and lost consciousness. And when I got my consciousness back, I was out in the middle of nowhere, and I looked down to my right, and I saw myself crying hysterically in the circle bed. And I looked up and to my left, and there I was as a baby, about a year old, crying just as hard in my crib. And I went back and forth looking at the two scenes, and then realized I did not want to be 32-year-old Barbara anymore. It was just too painful. So I felt like I let go of this lifetime and started moving towards the baby up in my upper left. And as I did that, this incredible energy, it took me years to use the word God. When I saw Star Wars a couple years later, this was in the 1970s, I said, that's what was holding me. It was the Force. Now I can say, God was holding me. God still is. God's here for everyone. We just have to have the awareness of the presence. Anyway, together we went to that infant, and it was as though she was in a bubble, and the bubble was in the middle of a cloud of bubbles, and in every bubble was another event from my past life. And in every bubble, I could feel again what I was feeling, and I could feel what the other people in the bubble were feeling, just like I did with my grandmother. And I could feel it through God. That energy that was holding me was permeating me. It was in every molecule of my being, holding me up, because I don't think I could have experienced this without God holding me. It was just so huge. And I kept hearing myself say, no wonder, no wonder. Because I had to go through my childhood again, and I could feel how horrible it was to constantly be hit and not know when you were going to get hit. But at the same time, I could feel my mother's sadness. I could feel my mother's numbness. I could feel what she went through in her childhood. And, this was the escape from the Bolshevik Revolution. This was her father was a grand mal epileptic, and she was the one that would have to get up every night and take care of him. Therefore, when I would get up in the middle of the night, she would be swinging at me because she probably thought she was back with her father. So anyway, the no wonders were, no wonder you are the way you are. Look at your childhood. Look what was done to you. And as my life evolved, as I went through that 32 years, I saw myself on the brink of treating my own children that way. I had 3 young children. I was on Valium. I was on Percocet. You name it, I had it. And I realized at that very moment that there had to be a lot of changes in my life. I couldn't put my kids through what I had been through. And then I was back. I was back here. I tried to tell the staff. They told me I had hallucinated. At a month in the circle bed, I was put in a full body cast from my armpits to my groin and then down one leg. And I had to live like that for 6 months. And they sent me home. And the whole world looked different. I had belonged to a garden club, and the garden club members, this was in the spring, had gone and planted all the annuals that I planted every year. They had just done the whole outside of our house the way I would do it. So when I pulled up from the hospital, I could see my house just with gorgeous colors all around it. And that's how my life started to unfold. Everything was so beautiful. I couldn't grasp the beauty, but I could certainly grasp the ecstasy of what it's like to truly see. Because when God let me see through God's eyes, that has remained. That has been one of my after effects. And my now husband and I have a different husband now, wrote a book called Dragon Energy, where we talk about the different dimensions. And I really believe that I had gone from third dimension living, which is what most of us are in, and been shown the fifth dimension, where everything is connected and everything is God. And it was incredible. Unfortunately, the father of my children didn't believe any of this, kept telling me I didn't have an experience, and kept telling me to go back being the way I was when we met, when I was 14. And finally, 9 years later, when we divorced, that was the last thing he said to me in marriage counseling was, if you'll go back to the way you were, we can stay married.
But there is no going back.
You can't go back when you grow. There's no way to shove that growth back into a little body. And this is my big bump in the road. I packed up, believe it or not, my good dishes, my Bose speakers, and all my clothes, and I drove from South Florida to Hartford, Connecticut, to apply as a research assistant to Dr. Bruce Grayson, who was the head of research for the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And this was at the UConn, University of Connecticut Medical School. In fact, he just came out with a book called After, where he's talking about the whole 40 years he did this research. So anyway, terrified, having lived in my parents' house until the day I moved into my husband's house, terrified and alone, I went to Connecticut. I knew one other person besides the two researchers I was going to work with. She had come to one of my talks when I was up in Connecticut before for a board meeting for this research. Anyway, and she invited me to come and live with her until I found a place. So I had somewhere to go, which was wonderful. And within 4 months, I had the position. I spent 6 years at the University of Connecticut Medical School interviewing people and studying the after effects of the near-death experience.
Oh, what an amazing opportunity.
I know. And the one thing that I did get, because the research assistants aren't paid very well, but I had tuition for my kids for college. And both my boys moved in with me. These are later teenagers going into their 20s, and they went to the University of Connecticut. And one of the kids graduated from there. Anyway, and then, about 7 years into all of this, or 6 years into all of this, I met my now husband, Charlie Whitfield. We had actually met 5 years earlier at a conference in Washington, D.C. We were asking Congress for funding to be able to research the continuation of consciousness after death. And Charlie heard me when I got up and talked, and he came over and introduced himself. And 5 years later, he was a professor, by the way, at the University of Maryland, and I was at the University of Connecticut. He would call me about 3 times a year, 4 times a year, and ask me research questions at the university. And I would mail him research papers. This was before the internet, with a cover letter. Anyway, I would send him the cover letter and research articles that we had to answer his question. 1989 or 88, I was pink slipped, which meant the funding was out for our research. So I was laid off. And I won't go into it because it's another long story, but miraculously, Simon & Schuster gave me a contract to write a book on my memoirs. Now, this first book is called Full Circle. And all the synchronicities from the day I had my NDE, that's what that book is. It's all God started guiding me. It is so amazing when Bruce Grayson wrote the introduction to Full Circle, and he said that he's been part of this story that is so out there, he has trouble believing it, but he witnessed it. One synchronicity after another, guiding me to even where I am now, and continues to guide me. I think that when we pray and we're asking God, we should realize that we need to listen too. And the synchronicities are really God talking or Spirit talking and us listening. So anyway, when my first book, Full Circle, came out in April of 1990, I was on Larry King Live for the second time. See, my boss and Ken Ring, my other colleague, they didn't like doing the TV stuff. I loved it. You know, they put you up in great hotels. They fly. It was Queen for a day. And I've been on every single talk show in the 80s and 90s. Anyway, so I'm on Larry King, but that was on Monday night. Friday night, my boys were usually with me when I would light my Sabbath candles on Friday night. And for some reason, they were both gone that night. So I'm saying my prayers. And all of a sudden, I look through these two flames of these two candles. And it hit me. I said, this is a direct line to God. And I said, dear God, please send me someone kind. Send me someone smart so I didn't have to act dumb anymore on dates. And then I have no idea where this came from, but I said, send me someone I deserve. Scary. Because
you worry about what are you projecting there.
Yeah, I mean, I had put myself in therapy the whole time because I wanted to know how to get out of all this stuff that we can now call PTSD. Mm-hmm. But I was living with post-traumatic stress disorder. So anyway, I had done a lot of work on myself, and I hoped that I didn't have that much to work on anymore because someone I deserve, who knows how much baggage he has to match my baggage. Anyway, I'm on Larry King Monday night. I come home Tuesday. Wednesday afternoon, the phone rings, and it's Charlie Whitfield, and he saw me on Larry King. And he was coincidentally coming up to Connecticut the next weekend, and he did speak at an ACOA international conference. And he asked me out for dinner on Friday night. He invited me to his talk and to have dinner with him after. Well, I had a patient with cancer who was getting chemo all week, and every night I was going over there and doing energy work on her because energy work is really good when you're getting chemo. So I apologized for not being able to meet him on Friday night, asked him if I could come for lunch on Saturday, and he said yes. Friday morning, the phone rings, and it's my patient, and she says they just canceled her treatment for that day. So I knew I could go hear Charlie. I called him at his office, and he had left already, and I just showed up at the conference that night. It was mind-blowing because there were 800 people sitting there waiting to hear him talk. I walked in and sat down. They seated me right up near the front. And for the next hour and a half, I had to listen to the international consul talking about putting this conference together. And then Charlie walked out. I didn't remember what he looked like from 5 years earlier. I just remembered his energy, and his energy was beautiful. He talked for an hour and a half with slides about feelings. This was 1990. Who was talking about feelings in 1990 and how they work? Anyway, after it was over and he was signing his books, there was a long line all the way around this huge room of people holding his books. His first one was Healing the Child Within, and that was mainly what and I had looked at that book when he called me to ask me out. He had sent me a copy of Healing the Child Within. I'm going to back up for a second. I had been pleading with Bruce and Ken Ring to put child abuse in one of our instruments to see if more people were like me and had near-death experiences and had had child abuse. And sure enough, 58% of our subjects in our research pool reported child abuse.
That's such an amazing correlation. Why do you think that is?
Because it's the truth. This is what we learned. For those of us who were abused as children, we dissociate. And psychiatry calls dissociation pathology. Ken Ring and I renamed dissociation, not as pathology, but as a way to survive. In fact, he called it a compensatory gift because we can survive huge trauma. We dissociate from it. We leave the painful scene and we can focus on another dimension. And a lot of times that dimension that we focus on is so spiritual that it's the moment that changes our life, because we know there's something so much bigger going on. So anyway, back to the child abuse issue. Ken and Bruce did not want to investigate child abuse. I did, and that's when I wanted to go into therapy so I could work on mine. Back then, they weren't talking about trauma. The medical schools didn't want to know about trauma, didn't want to know about addiction, because a lot of them are traumatized and addicted.
That's very true.
It is. Ask them to take a trauma report, and they look at you like, huh? But anyway, when I realized I was going to be having dinner with Charlie, I pulled his book off the shelf. People were sending me books all the time to review for our journal, the Journal of Near-Death Studies. And so I had taken Charlie's book and put it on the shelf. So before I was going to go have dinner with this man, I took the book off the shelf, I opened it up, and it was exactly what I wanted Ken and Bruce to do. Charlie had already done it. So we not only recognized each other as soulmates, we were mates when it came to our work, when it came to our research, when it came to our writing. We are so complementary to each other. I got somebody I deserved.
Oh, that's such a nice story. I like that. If I could, I want to take you back to when you first went to UConn in the research position. Was being around people who believed in your experience and had similar experiences comforting?
Oh, it was a whole new world opened up. We looked at each other and we recognized each other. Bruce and I started a support group, and we met one night a month in the psych research teacher's lab. And we would have anywhere between 30 and 40 people who would walk in with that look on their face. We all had that look. It was like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. We were all searching, and everybody would start pouring out their stories, and we'd be crying and we'd be laughing. And we started getting camera crews from all over the world coming and doing documentaries on our research. So we felt like this wasn't only our message now. We had a way to give it to the world through all these different, between the talk shows and the documentaries, we got to say a lot in the late 80s, early 90s.
For somebody who does not believe in any sort of afterlife or their soul or whatever, what would you say to them? What advice would you give them?
Well, I don't think there is any advice. I've been somewhere they haven't been. I've had an experience that they haven't had. So I think more than anything, I would excuse them for not believing me, because I've had something that I experienced that they haven't experienced. However, we now know there are lots of other triggers for opening up to these kinds of experiences and realizing that the world is so much bigger than we've been told. Our world, the universe, is so much bigger. Long-term yoga, long-term meditation, childbirth, nowhere near dying. I've interviewed so many mothers that had these experiences as their babies were born, but nothing had happened to them physically. Then there's people that are in automobile accidents and the car is spinning out of control. They don't get hurt, but while it's spinning, they're having this experience. We call it the fear-death experience, because you're so afraid. It again becomes what I talked about earlier, this interface between trauma and spirit. So there are many other ways. And what Bruce Grayson is saying in his new book, After, is just reading about these experiences. It's contagious. When you hear enough people telling you the same thing that happens when we're dying, that's contagious. So I would tell people that don't understand what I'm talking about to start reading the literature in near-death experiences.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path. because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life. You can subscribe to our free podcast at www.bumpintheroad.us or become a premium member to hear the full conversation. Just go to www.bumpintheroad.us for more information and to sign up.